Is the United States a nation of immigrants? On a long enough time scale, isn't every country? Human migrations have been a consistent part of history, but equally consistent has been a clear set of rules and controls for allowing certain individuals in and keeping others out. Much like a home has a lock and key for the residents, a nation loses all integrity if its doors are flung wide open. Those who do not own the home, such as visitors or even temporary residents, are much less likely to take good care of the building. Anyone who has lived in an apartment knows this. So selecting who is allowed in becomes key. But in a country like America, and increasingly the rest of the Western world, the residents are being told they must share their keys with their neighbors and give them free meals and room to stay. The citizens have consistently voted against this, but the true owners of the country, the wealthy and their paid politicians, have decided they want more servants. The citizens are angry, yet their voices are ignored.
Well, I'm not a crook. I've earned everything I've got.
Military-industrial complex.
A new world order.
But we are here to destroy the control over the industry of other people.
I did not trade arms for hostages.
It's been time to be a
Напомни разгромленности захватчиков.
Myth20c podcast.
Hello, and welcome to the Myth of the 20th Century podcast. I'm Hans Launder. Today, I'm joined by my co-hosts Adam Smith.
Hey, guys.
Hank Oslo.
Hey, what's up?
And Nick Mason.
Hey.
Today, we're talking about one of the more complex and difficult topics of American history, mostly 20th century American history, and that is the topic of immigration. Much has been said in the last 30, 40 years about America being a proposition nation, America being a nation of immigrants, a nation of mercantile immigrant strength, and a free market nation that should embrace liberal immigration policies because they better the economy. The Cato Institute told you so. Everyone from Harvard told you so. Why would they lie? The truth is that America is not a nation of immigrants. Ann Coulter rightly said once that America is really a nation of English and Dutch settlers. They were the primary architects of our legal system. They were the primary architects of the American Revolution. And they were the primary architects of the first, 40 to 50 years of American systems, economic system, scientific system, cultural system. Essentially, everything that built up the United States the way it was the result of an Anglo-Dutch partnership, really. And it was primarily an English system with Dutch input over time. To take you back deep into history, really the English started showing up in North America on what's now the eastern seaboard of the United States in 1607 with Jamestown. And there's a great book I really recommend everyone read called Albion's Seed, The Four British Folkways in America by David Hackett Fisher. I've seen a lot of people try to figure out what the American civilization is and where it comes from. And this book really helps dissect the origins of the United States and the origins of early immigration and who actually built the United States. There's a great article by Lawrence Murray over at The Right Stuff who summarized it actually fairly well. And he summarizes the four primary groups that made up the early American people. These would be Puritans, who primarily came out of southeast England, and they primarily settled in New England. These were very anti-royalist. They were they were highly religious. They were progressive, and they formed the backbone of what the Republican Party was in the 19th century and later the Democratic Party. many of the waspy Harvard-type elites that we see today, that we often kind of mock, are descended actually from the Puritans. They are the true. They have really the true birthright to America in a lot of ways, and they've changed a great deal as time has gone on. The next group we have are the Cavaliers, who came out of South and Western England. So they settled mostly in Chesapeake Bay and the coastal South. These are royalists. So the early problems that the colonialists had when they were trying to break from the king in the late 18th century were with Cavalier descended aristocrats who were at their core crown royalists and did not see the benefits of Republican virtues as much as the progressive puritanical individuals did in the North. In fact, a lot of the founding fathers, including George Washington himself, are descended from this kind of royalist class, which is why, in particular, with Washington breaking with the crown, at the time, if you read the book 1776 by David McCullough, it was really a huge shock to people back in England that someone like Washington and some of his cohorts, who were descended from lines going back centuries, would break in such a violent and enthusiastic way. The third group would be Quakers. They were from northern England, the Midlands of England, as well as Germany, and some of the early Scandinavians. These would be Danes, Norwegians, and so on. They mostly settled in Delaware and Pennsylvania. The Pennsylvania Dutch and the kind of the folksy ways of the Midwesterners descend a lot from these people. And finally, you had borderers. These were the Scots-Irish. These were the Ulster Scots. These were Northern English, and they were far more working class. They were far a lot tougher. They were far less aristocratic, and they're actually still very much like their distant cousins in Northern England now. They have mostly manufacturing and skills-based talents, and they settled a lot around Appalachia and the South, and they eventually moved to help populate Texas and California. Personally, I will say, not to give too much away, but my family line goes back to sort of a Yankee Anglo-Dutch group in the Northeast who were related to Peter Stuyvesant. So I have a lot invested in immigration talk. It's a personal matter for me, and I know it's a personal matter for all of us on the show. Basically, once the American Revolution was mostly finished, you had a lot of people who were quickly trying to determine what the character of the nation was going to be, and very quickly it became apparent that there were going to need to be tough choices about who could be an American and who couldn't. So you had several early naturalization acts. 1790, the law limited naturalization to immigrants who were free white persons of good character. It thus excluded American Indians, indentured servants, slaves, free blacks, and Asians. The Naturalization Act of 1795, the act specified that naturalized citizenship was reserved only for free white persons. Naturalization Act of 1798, the Naturalization Act of 1790, 95, and 1978 also restricted citizenship to free white persons. So before the revolution is really totally finished and before things have been made square with the English crown, they're already crafting immigration legislation. It made it clear that the nation was restricted to Europeans. There's a quote, or there's a passage from Thomas Paine's Common Sense that is often used as an argument for open borders immigration, which is regards to a place of asylum for all of those in trouble around the world. And it's actually often misquoted and it's misused, or as Paine later said in the same document, that America has a kinship with Europe and Europe only, that America is the child of Europe. And he made it very clear that he wanted nothing to do with people who were not Europeans. And rooted in historical context, there were a lot of people in Europe, what we would consider Europe now, that he did not consider Europeans. Alexander Hamilton is another person that is often brought up as being pro-immigration. The funny thing is that Alexander Hamilton was a pure mercantilist. He wanted the maximum economic optimization for the United States of America under any circumstance. But Alexander Hamilton had very, very harsh views on what could constitute an immigrant and what they had to undergo to become a citizen. To become a citizen, they had to have been a resident for several years. They had to have demonstrated fluent and clear English. They had to have demonstrated a vast amount of skill. They had to have demonstrated that they were not going to get broke anytime soon. Basically, Hamilton wanted an influx of only white immigrants ever, and he only ever wanted citizenship, the ability to vote, to really own property, to participate in the political process, restricted to people who were, in his idea, worthy of the same English aristocratic class that had built the country. So I don't know if you guys have anything on this before we move on. It's pretty radical.
Scott Alexander has a pretty excellent review of the book Albion Seed. It's worth looking up if you sort of want the gloss. It includes some pretty hilarious anecdotes about the respective groups and their early participation in the American endeavor.
Mm-hmm.
I wanted to ask Hans about the philosophy in the first 50 years or so of the United States regarding immigrants. You mentioned Hamilton had a more mercantilist approach where he wanted to maximize the economy, so more customers, more workers is better. But you also mentioned that he was fairly limited in how he defined a good immigrant. And so there was a sort of underlying trend between his group and maybe the group that didn't want any immigrants, that there are good and bad people in this world and we want the good ones. Is that accurate?
Yeah.
And can you expand on that? And how did they define that? And then why did it change?
So the phrase often used is of good character. One of the marks of good character was typically not Catholic, actually, but it was also the ability to not be a prostitute, not be a drunk, not be someone who was planning to use the poorhouses or the good grace of the Protestant churches. This was really before there was a true welfare system. There was none.
How did they determine that though? Because this was before airplanes. People were getting off ships, and it was like, sorry, you got to go back for another 2 months or whatever it is on the ocean. There were ways where you could restrict it at port entry, and when you were making a note of who was entering, they were doing this very early on. That wasn't hard to set up because it was the only way to get to America was to go to a port. And once you were in a port, you had to declare your ship name, and all of this was easily kept track of and this was infrastructure that the colonials had set up. And it was easy to get a tally typically of, okay, who's on this boat, who are they, where are they from, so on. So if you have, in the early days, if you have Irishmen coming, they were not very receptive to them. They were typically kept track of while they were in the city doing their business, and then they would leave. There was no smuggling or bribes being paid. I'm sure that there was that, but it was limited mostly because there was just a general stigma. Like people were not going to do business with you. So you had true freedom of association, and you could effectively not speak to or not have anything to do with an Irish Catholic who just got off the boat if you wanted. And no one could say anything to your business. No one could say anything to you. And in fact, you're probably encouraged to.
and your church, your local church, was probably encouraged to not help out immigrants coming off the boats. And also the fact that if you had enough money to get on a ship to the United States, and like right after the Revolution, if you even wanted to, and the U.S. had a really bad reputation in Europe right after the Revolution. You were probably of pretty high agency and a lot of money. Travel was expensive if you wanted to travel outside of like slave ship conditions.
What about the indentured servants? Wasn't that a big thing back then?
They were coming, but they were explicitly banned from participating in the political process. So if you were declared an indentured servant, you had no political rights.
Wow. This is after America was independent?
Some of this was being declared while the country was still at war and sorting out its differences with Britain on like the status of the new laws and how they were, reparations, like all kinds of things were still in flux, and they're already determining who can be an American and who can't. Like there's no clue even at this time whether or not the United States is going to be victorious. Mm-hmm. And they're already saying, just in case, here's our guidelines on who's going to be an American, who's not.
Was this something that was a hot button issue? I mean, it's obviously today a big issue, but was this kind of a thing that people were wanting to bring up constantly at the Constitutional Convention or whatever they held to have these discussions?
Yeah, because these guys were very keenly aware of issues of homogeneity and cultural cohesion, and they knew that something as delicate as a republic, without strong rulers or dictatorial powers, they could just do things on a whim. If something like that was going to function cleanly and responsibly, you needed to have a group of people who were all invested in one another and were all alike and could easily sort out differences. We'll get into this later, but this immediately starts to break down by the late 19th century when Boston has been turned into an Irish city. I mean, Boston was like the heart of the Anglo revolutionary spirit, of the intellectual class that arose after the Revolution and later conflicts with Britain. I mean, a lot of the great American authors of the early 19th and mid 19th century are from Boston or lived there while they were writing. By 1900, it was mostly Irish. It was mostly Irish and non-Anglo, and they were reduced to like small minority aristocrat status, which was never the intention. These guys did not want to be elites ruling over a big amount of serfs, like manorialism. That was never what they wanted. And in fact, in a lot of ways, the early U.S. was trying to, I think, reject that Anglo to Anglo. They were not, that was just not part of the agenda. And there had to have been some systematic advantage in their mind to ensuring that you kept your population as strong as possible. So there even their ideas on who could come from the German principalities and states at the time, this is before the rise of a unified Germany, were pretty limited. And they were not interested in Bavarians coming. They were not interested in Thuringians. They were not interested in probably 60-70% of what we think of as Germans at the time. They were not interested. They're not interested in Spaniards or anything like that.
There's some nice quotes by Benjamin Franklin complaining about stupid, swarthy Germans as opposed to the, I guess, intelligent, non-swarthy variety.
I was going to offer a theory as to why this wave of immigrants changed so much later in the American history. It was, you said, late 19th century where Boston had become largely Irish. I don't know what it is, but in Boston, I never pictured that as like a big It's just a small area, I guess, but it's not exactly a place where you can have a lot of farms. I've heard the soils are kind of rocky and everything. So the population obviously is not going to be able to support all those immigrants unless they're doing something else. And I think what changed was that the Industrial Revolution started taking hold in America, and all these immigrants were suddenly very attractive to some of the wealthy industrialists. Now, that may not be the case in the earlier part of the 19th century, but I think by the late 19th, you had your Carnegies and you had your Fricks and all these huge owners of huge industrial complexes in Pennsylvania and places like that just needed workers and to mine the coal, to work the mills, to do all the construction work, the railroads, and all that sort of thing. But in the earlier days of America, it was largely people just knocking trees over and putting farms up. And I think there wasn't this sort of huge, you can call it a mercantilist, but there wasn't really an industrialist class that actually incentivized maybe the politicians to try to get in these cheap workers. And I think we've ever since then, we've had that incentive from big business to bring people in.
Yeah, I mean,
do you think that's why that happened, though? That's just my theory. In that time period, why were those Irish coming in? Because they obviously couldn't all farm potatoes in Boston. It's just too small an area. So what were they doing there? Were they working, for somebody else? That's my guess.
Yeah. So basically, what happened was the Industrial Revolution. By early 19th century, and along with the agricultural revolution, and as the Midwest was starting to be somewhat populated, and you're having it was really before the Homestead Act was big, but you had early homesteads out there. You had these expansive farms still in the rural South and in rural New England that were growing rapidly and could feed a lot of people. You didn't run into this problem of scale. So, and I mean in like the dissident right sense, it's all capitalized. So
MPC scale.
Yeah, the MPC scale. I have an article actually by our friend Ryan Landry that kind of explains it on Social Matter. But scale is size, complexity, atomization, liberalization, and elitism. So you don't run into that problem of like too much size, complexity, and atomization, because you had at the time still enough productive farmland without these huge expansions into the Midwest, which happened later, of the Great Plains soil to feed all these people coming into Boston. Also at the time, the U.S. was rapidly growing as a trading power. So they were trading a lot for food. And if you were living in Boston, it's not like all you have to worry about is that the food survived and wasn't too rotten from wherever else it was farmed, and by the time it got to the bay. It wasn't like you lived in inland Ohio and you were trying to wait on food imports. I mean, you were growing your own food if you lived out there. It also, I mean, the population in the U.S. was just not that big at the time. It didn't have a lot of people to feed, and the Irish immigration actually really started with the potato famine.
Right.
So you had in the 40s, you had the rise of the potato famine, which is partially the fault of British aristocrats, and basically the Irish.
Could you go over that again real quick? What happened?
I mean, with the potato famine.
Why was it the British aristocrats? Why are they partly to blame?
I've heard competing theories on this. Maybe Hank can jump in if he knows anything about it. But basically, that they mispriced the potato. It was like a pricing issue, and a lot of these pieces of land were owned by British aristocrats who were using them poorly and were just liquidating these assets as much as they could without taking care of them properly.
I think it was also part of the fact that they weren't allowed to do anything but farm potatoes. If they had maybe a backup crop, it might have helped.
Yeah, the Irish were like effectively genocided. They were treated as a completely captive colony. The vast majority of the land was devoted to growing corn, as they called it. It wasn't necessarily like our corn, our maize, but for export. And then the Irish were essentially living off of a subsistence economy of the densest calories per acre you can get, which is potatoes. And the blight ended up wiping out most of that. They weren't granted any sort of relief from starvation, effectively, because that wasn't really a government policy at the time to sort of like try to attain any elasticity in the food market there to like try to prevent the famine. So yeah, they were deeply screwed.
So they show up in America, and there was a nice social worker with an EBT card waiting for them, right?
We wish.
EBT. We gotta have a backronym for that. English blight something. I don't know.
Yeah.
Basically, I'm trying to find. I had a piece of data here. Ah, here we go. So, from like 1850 onwards, or until 1880, Ireland was had delivered like almost 1 million people to the United States, which was a lot at the time, and they were concentrating pretty much in 3 or 4 major areas, which would be the cities on the upper East Coast, so New England. And they mostly fulfilled jobs like laborer positions, dock workers, things like that. That there was already kind of an English working class that was descended from people who fought in the Revolution. Probably, a lot of these guys, their dads and their granddads fought in the Revolution, and they were not happy to have this massive influx of Irishmen. The old stuff about they're taking our jobs is legitimate. Like they were very quickly employed working for less, and you had this is kind of the rise of not really like labor unions really, but you had organized labor efforts by these English laborers in cities that their forefathers had been in since before the Revolution to prevent this. It didn't really work though, and it never does. So yeah, like I said, in 1850 they had alone 962,000. I read that wrong originally. That was just, they were the top. In 1850, more people came from Ireland than Germany, almost more than Germany and Great Britain combined. And this is including German states that were kind of allowed to have people come in. You also had a lot of people coming in from Canada, which, at that time, those are mostly just a combination of Englishmen who had probably left originally when the Revolution happened, and then as things solidified in the United States, came back, or some French Canadians. And then there's a huge drop-off in numbers, and you're getting some people from France, from Switzerland, and 13,000 from Mexico, right? Which is nothing. By 1880, it shifted. The number one source of immigrants were Germans at 1.967 million, so almost 2 million.
That's a lot. What was driving the immigration from Germany?
A lot of things. So there were a series of revolts and revolutions throughout continental Europe, mostly in inland Europe, like the revolutions of 1848, and all kinds of problems with the Pope, several wars, having a lot of issues inside the German states. And even after Bismarck had started taking steps to unite this place into what we know as Germany, it wasn't working very well. One of the theories I've seen is that, in particular, it was still the Anglos in England were undermining Germans. They were flooding the German markets and continental Europe with cheap goods. And their strategy had always been to keep Germans disunited, preoccupied with regional concerns, and very kind of tedious stuff. And before the unified German state really developed a common tariff policy, the English were able to take advantage and keep breaking up keep breaking up Germany, or the German states, over and over and over again. So this is really before that had taken effect. But even still, by 1900, when you have a united Germany with a good tariff policy, they're still the leading exporter of people. They have 2.6 million people come in 1900. And the Irish level of immigration had actually decreased.
Wait, but by 1900, not just that one.
No, in the year 1900, if I'm reading this right, 2.6 million people.
That's almost hard to believe. That's really big.
I mean, and I could be reading this. This is from infoplease.com.
Okay.
But yeah, they had exported either in that year alone or up to that point. Either way, it's an incredible amount of people in one set of territories that's pretty limited in how much you can actually export to the United States. Like they were the American Anglos were never happy about a lot of the Germans. I have a quote.
Well, when was it when they were debating what the national? This is like still contentious. Like there's no national language in America. I think they were discussing what some usage of language in some government function was going to be, and they had to decide between German and English. I don't know when that was, but I remember learning about that.
Yeah, like that's kind of a weird historical meme, is that there was almost a point where we were a dual language country in the early days, because there was this smattering of German communities throughout the U.S. that had insulated themselves and were printing German newspapers. There were dozens of German language newspapers in various dialects of German. It wasn't even there was no unified Hochdeutsch. It was weird, and very quickly I think that they put a stop to that. So in like 1874, there was they were trying to reserve like Western land, like homesteads and so on, for these German-speaking communities that only spoke German, and the U.S. Congress rejected it and told them essentially to get lost, because they were worried about foreign interference. Like they literally went to these Mennonites, these German-speaking Mennonites, and said, "We're worried that you were probably working for the German governments, so we're not interested in helping you do anything, and you can leave." I mean, just the thought of it was insulting to the U.S. Congress, which was pretty much still Anglos at this point, that these Germans would be so uppity to even demand that, or even to even ask that. They were just told immediately no.
Yeah, Mennonites are the fucking worst.
Yeah, but the idea that we've always been a nation of immigrants, we've always welcomed, is just such bullshit. Like these guys were treating people who were mostly their racial kin. I mean, the especially the Southern English and the Southwestern English are pretty well descended from Teutonics. And they're treating them horribly. I mean, they're just essentially telling them, "We're not interested in allowing you to do anything. You're allowed to maybe work, but that's it. We're certainly not going to accommodate you in any way."
Well, let's think about this. Everybody does something for a reason, and so it's usually for selfish reasons. And why was there resistance to these people, do you think?
I mean, there's probably a lot of resistance because the Anglos still thought of it as their country, and I guess sort of the Anglo-Dutch too. They fought a war. I mean, they shot sometimes their brothers in the face with a musket to control this country. I mean, if you put in that much sacrifice for something, and less than 100 years later, you have a group of very aggressive, sort of ridiculous Germans, like the Mennonites, telling you that they're going to go do something, and they're only going to speak German, and they're only going to be insulated, and they're going to produce things for themselves, and they're not going to be involved. They're still going to live. They're still going to expect like the general rights of an American. I mean, it was so politically insulting to everyone across.
So why were they allowed in the first place is the next question.
I think that they were allowed in because the mercantilist ideas of Hamilton and his guys still kind of trickled through. And there was this sense that we need to populate the country as much as we can.
Now, was that a commonly shared belief, or was it even ever put to a vote? Or this is basically stuff they talked about in the Senate because that's where the rich people were?
I mean, if you polled people, they probably... there are not a lot of great polls from these early days.
Because I'll make a contention that I don't think immigration is ever popular with a domestic group by and large, unless it happens to coincide with their own ethnic or kin group.
Yeah, but I mean, and here's another passage from Brumellow's book. I mean, in '85, objected to the organized importation of English immigrants to form buffer settlements. He's not even willing to import like his literal cousins from England.
Well, that's how we see it now, but I'm just trying to get to the heart of why people resist
I don't know.
these things.
I think that there was more of a New England progressive Republican type approach, and there was also the Hamiltonian people, and these guys were also steeped in the Enlightenment stuff, and they genuinely thought of like Europe as their true mother, and they believed in all these things in concordance, and it arrives at the conclusion that you should let in European immigrants. Mm-hmm. And if they work hard enough, and if they demonstrate true devotion over a space of several years, maybe you allow them part of the political process. I mean, you also have to remember that when these early naturalization acts were being set up that were declaring who could be a citizen, you had to own land. So the assumption worked into the early system was that if you are high agency enough to become a true landowner in the United States, you're probably hit all of our requirements. So you should be allowed to have a say.
And you also have enough sort of invested in the system. You have a very vested interest. In a lot of areas, it was common that, like, if you owned property in two different counties, you would vote in both counties, assuming you were a citizen, because you had a stake in the governance of both of those political bodies.
Yeah. I mean, early on, you had groups like the Know Nothings, and they were adamantly opposed to immigration, to even assimilation in a lot of ways. They were not necessarily interested in trying to turn these people into American Anglos. It was not something that they thought was important or that should be done. There was a general thought that, and it's still true to this day, the best way to grow your population and to populate your nation and to expand is to grow your population naturally, because you do not run into these problems of having to sort out foreign influence. You don't run into these cultural cohesion problems. You simply don't. I mean, maybe it takes longer. Maybe it takes 1.5 times as long or twice as long to populate the Midwest. But the U.S. would probably be a far more cohesive country if it was still very much predominantly Anglo-Dutch and High German. And maybe some Scandinavian. It just, things changed, and that's, this stuff about like the American nations were kind of split up. That's part of it, is that you had these different cultures from different immigrant backgrounds coalescing too much and away from sort of the Anglo heart of the early country. And that's not to say that these people have not done well and have not contributed a lot. They have. I'm perfectly fine to share a country with the Scandinavians and the Finns up in Minnesota. I think they've done a hell of a lot for the country, and just to quote Trump, they're great people. But you can't argue that the founders weren't scared for no reason, and probably weren't ultimately right that it would. The country was too big. The American public system was too loose to have a functioning empire of various small cultures existing coterminously. It was not set up to be the Austro-Hungarian Empire.
And, you mentioned the know-nothings a bit ago. Like, every single one of their criticisms actually turned out to be empirically accurate. Like, importing large numbers of Irish actually did shift U.S. politics permanently to the left. It also brought us, like, the first real instances of machine politics, where you have, like, sort of this kind of quasi-ethnical mafia-type association that just runs an entire city and necessitates this very corrupt mode of governance, like this Tammany Hall style governance. And that was exactly what the know-nothings were afraid was going to happen.
Yeah. I mean, I just want to make it clear, like between like 1770 and 1830, we had very little immigration. We had a lot of outflows. I think you had maybe 100,000 people, which was big at the time, in total over a space of a few decades, leave after the revolution had kicked off and after it had finished.
That's an important point, actually.
Yeah.
To harp on.
And I mean, that's where Canada comes from. For those who are curious, the history of Canada is essentially people who weren't okay with the revolution.
This notion of sort of like coming to America and for the purpose of becoming, in some sense, metaphysically American was never really a thing. And it only became even a meme relatively recently. It was extremely common for you to get on a ship, come to the United States, make a comparatively high amount of money, and then go back to the old country and be the Irish dude with the sick whip, or the Italian dude who's able to buy an Olive Garden or whatever they have back there. And it's still actually to this day extremely common for these backflows where coming to the U.S. is like an explicitly transient endeavor. It's one of the reasons why even the term immigration is a little bit fraught, because you're not necessarily immigrating per se. You're not necessarily coming here with the intention even of staying.
I've heard that before. I wonder if you want to venture guess, if you don't have it, but do you know what the numbers were on that? Like, how common was it? Was it 10%? Was it 50% of the returnees of immigrants?
I don't have the exact numbers. I'm struggling to find it off really quick. In Brunello's book, he does talk about it, these outflows in the early days, and just generally you have particularly from poorer countries. When we had Kathy on, who talked about Lithuania, a lot of people go back. I mean, the percentages probably vary, but maybe sometimes it's as high as a third. They just can't. I mean, they maybe make some money, maybe they don't, and they go back. Or they make some money, they kind of settle down, they don't like it, they go back. Nowadays, the incentive to go back is probably not as great because you're actively encouraged by the culture, by the elites, to stay. No. Whatever. Your Santa Muerte stuff is totally fine here. You should stay. That was just, there was no way a lot of stuff that flies now would fly then, particularly in the cities, which are still tightly controlled by, especially on the Eastern Seaboard, by the Anglos, who were still interested in seeing a general character to their city, and it didn't always involve the cultural practices of other Europeans, and certainly not non-Europeans.
So why were the Jews let in?
We'll get to that. That really kicks off in the later half of the 19th century.
I think they actually were cheap labor for a period. Hard to believe, but in New York, at least, they were. In Brooklyn, I think the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory, whatever.
Wait! Jews labor?
Yeah,
Source,
please. I mean,
shockingly, right? Garment sector was heavily Jewish.
Do we want to just skip to this, or do we have other stuff that we want to?
I mean, there's some other stuff before we get to our chosen people friends, but I mean,
Nick said nothing until now, and that's what he had to say.
So, basically, and we'll start off here, but basically, the majority of the Jews that were coming from the Russian Empire. They were coming from Eastern Europe, which was mostly just controlled by the Russian Empire, if not directly through influence and through parts of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And in all these places, particularly towards the latter half of the 19th century, they were not very well liked. And they were quickly running out of options, let's say, about what their future was going to be. The plan to have a distributed capital network through the Caucasus and maybe Central Asia, I know that was that was one of their plan at one point, to kind of mass immigrate down there. That didn't work. You still kind of see that to an extent with the mountain Jews of the Caucasus. Really, they came to the United States because the immigration policies became more liberalized. As long as you could generally fit in, and as long as you could pass for a European, which had been expanded at that point to include a lot more people, you could come in and work. Becoming a citizen was still kind of difficult. Becoming in and working, a lot easier, especially after the Civil War had ended and you had the progressive Republican types that completely taken over the country. Really quickly, I want to say in 1819 is actually when the first significant federal legislation to immigration was starting to be passed. And there are several provisions in these pieces of legislation. They established the continuing reporting of immigration to the United States and set specific sustenance rules for passengers of ships leaving U.S. port for Europe. So a lot of the records that we have of pre-20th century immigration in the U.S. always start in 1820, right after this got passed, because that's when they really started to try and have an organized federal approach. This is after the Articles of Confederation had been mostly thrown out, so the Constitution's in place. You have a stronger federal government to who is coming into the country, how many people from where are coming in, basic metrics that you want to keep track of. And then in 1864, the centralized control of immigration under the Secretary of State with a commissioner, so Commissioner of Immigration, I think. And that's where the importation of contract laborers. So this is where you're getting a lot of these Irish, a lot of these Central Europeans, these lower Germans. And I don't mean lower in a bad way. I mean literally from the lower part of Germany. And even
that means the northern part of Germany. It's the lowlands. Is that what that means?
Well, no, I mean low geographic.
Southern then.
Yeah, southern. Mm-hmm. Southern. And 1868 is when American birthright legislation is passed with the 14th Amendment to the Constitution.
Which is, when we say birthright citizenship, it's not clear that that's actually sort of encoded by the 14th Amendment in the sense that it's sort of used today.
Yeah.
Nobody at the time that they were passing the 14th Amendment thought that that was like sort of a important proviso or implication of that.
Yeah, I mean, let's keep in context the fact that pretty much every one of the founding fathers is dead by that point, and most of their first descendants are dead or quickly coming out of power to their descendants. So the people who would have been, who would just never have considered birthright citizenship, like if you had proposed even 1868 birthright citizenship, let alone today, if you had proposed that to this early Anglo stock, it would have been just disgusting to them. Like there would have been no way that would have been allowed. No way, like that you can just show up and have birth. You can birth a child, and immediately, without proving anything, that child is an American, is as good an American as they are. Like that would have been really insulting. And again, because these are people who put blood, sweat, and tears into creating their American identity. One of the, and this kind of gets into a topic, like one of the things that this immigration has ultimately done to help undo the kind of fragile framework of the American Republic as it was intended to be is undo meritocracy. Meritocratic principles were really built into the government. They were built into a lot of the early literature in the United States, like Tocqueville's Democracy in America. The idea of like divine right of kinglyship, divine hierarchy, thrown out, totally thrown out. You had radical Protestantism essentially, where it was you had God and that was it, and you made your true efforts. This was very Calvinistic of these people. Made your efforts entrepreneurially, communally, in public service, whatever. But it was meritocracy. You worked as hard as you could, as long as you could, for as many years as you could. And that was meant to sustain the republic system, so that you didn't have to have a lot of intrusion. You didn't have to have a lot of careful managerialist policy. You didn't need to have that, as if you maintain this super tightly knit meritocracy that fell apart. And then in 1875, it was kind of a weird death blow to immigration policy. You had post-Civil War era politics were about centralization under D.C. And post-Civil War American politics included shutting down individual states' abilities to control their own immigration policy. So by 1875, it's SCOTUS rules it's a federal matter, and states don't have a lot to say.
That's had big implications recently with Sheriff Arpaio and Arizona.
I mean, a couple of years ago, you had Obama essentially dropping off immigrants in Texas without notifying the governor, both Perry and then Abbott, without saying a word.
I mean, without going
enrichment by surprise.
Yeah, I mean that's exactly what it was. Like,
yeah, without knowing how it's done, there are conspiracy theories that like there's literally like UPS, black UPS, like cargo jets being filled up with Somalis, but whatever. But the fact is, they're in random places in the country everywhere, and so you really do have to question. Well, did we share a border with Somalia now? I mean, I don't think my understanding of tectonic drift is not that great, but I don't think we've actually rejoined Africa. So how are they getting here? And they're kind of poor, right? So who's like paying for their airfare and housing and all that? There's obviously an agenda, and it's not a state-run one, from what I can tell. It's federal because they have the printing press. That's getting into contemporary stuff, but I mean, it connects to what you just said. I mean, it's the centralization of everything.
You know, it's important. Do you have something, Nick?
I was just going to say it's widely understood that by surprise is the best kind of enrichment. It comes at you in a mall with a knife, comes down the road in a truck. You don't see it coming, and the next thing you know, you're enriched all over the street.
I shouldn't laugh, but it's true.
It brings us joy. It brings us happiness. It brings us vibrancy.
So that same year, by the way, you had the passing of the Immigration Act of 1870, which made a outright ban on prostitutes, criminals, drunkards, pretty much. When you have this centralization, and maybe the silver lining is that then you can enforce something like this. You can have immigration officials go down to the ports or the borders and say, okay, who are you? What do you do? Let me ask you some basic questions about what you were back in the old country. You're a prostitute, or you murdered 3 guys in Hungary. You're getting on the next boat out of here.
How do they actually know that back then? I mean, we didn't exactly have Interpol.
Before the invention of antibiotics,
inspections.
Like, you got the ship full of the guys, or the ladies without noses. I think you're gonna go back.
This speaks to a point. I'm sure some of the listeners are familiar with the libertarian writer Hans Hermann Hoppe, and
Triple H.
In his book, Democracy, the
God that failed.
Papers, essays. What?
Oh, you cut out. Democracy, the God that failed.
Oh, I cut out. I'm so... Yeah.
Keep
Democracy, the God that failed. He draws a contrast between monarchy and democracy, and the key point with respect to immigration is just, well, why would a system ever want, why would a political system, why would a state ever want shitty people? Like, why would there ever be a reason for that? Well, in a democratic system, the more democratic your system is, the more shitty people can be used to enfranchise political hacks. And whereas a system that is run for the benefit of the state in the long term is going to be more selective as to what kind of people they want to incorporate in their system. And so it seems that this was a time when America still, the democratic pressures had not gone all the way yet, and you still had the state sort of planning for its own interests in a longer term. Would that be correct, Hans, or is it more just a proxy for some kind of ethnic discrimination?
No, I think you're right. I mean, what's the famous Hopper line? If they had bad manners, they would be physically punished. I mean, Hans Hermann Hoppe had essentially the immigration policy of George Washington, which is like, I don't care if they're my cousin. Like, if I suspect one bad trait, they're not coming in, and they're on the next boat out of here.
Right. That's what I'm getting at. Is just like, why is it that? I mean, it's stark contrast between this immigration system that discriminates against obvious undesirables now, where it's like, you got some murders.
It's still
bring
like,
them in.
It's always been like discriminatory towards unwanted people. It's just that
but it's a definition of what is unwanted.
Exactly is unwanted. Like, if you're some like random British person and you want to come to the U.S., like, it is a huge pain in the ass to actually assemble all of the documents that you need, find the correct class of visa, probably hire a lawyer, get a job, move all your shit, go through customs.
Which is why if we have any, listeners out of states who want to come here or whatever, I think the best strategy is to become as undesirable from a normal perspective as possible. Claim to be a faggot, claim to be, obsessed with the anuses of other men, claim that you're a woman, that you're a Jew. Well, they'll probably check if you're a Jew, but you just make yourself as shitty as possible if you want to come in.
Yeah, I mean, one of the parts of, I guess, revisionist history on the Civil War era is that actually all this massive importation of Irishmen in particular was done because they needed to fill up the ranks of the Union Army in order to just completely overpower the Southern Army, because you had a lot of people who were in the North who were just not interested in fighting their cousins down in Virginia and down in Tennessee.
then turned hilarious in the draft riots when the Irish, I think the expression was, "We want no part of Abraham's nigger war."
Yeah, no, I remember that. Yeah, we want of Abraham.
Well, it's like the use of the German mercenary on the part of the British.
Yeah, the Hessians, who actually, I mean, not after long, you had a lot of Hessians coming into the United States, but and by the way, Hessians are still around in the German region of Hesse, Hesse. They're still going. They've been a German principality for hundreds and hundreds of years, and at the time, they were actually kind of shafted by the British generals. They were not given proper information. They were not given good maps. The British generals just kind of threw them into the American wilderness and said, "Go hunt some rebels," and Washington made pretty quick work of them, which was, I think, in a lot of ways, kind of captured the imagination of the Germans of the States over the years. Is how quickly this elite group of mercenaries was just totally put down by a group of guys who crossed the Delaware River on Christmas Eve with some blankets on their back and muskets that didn't work to kill you as fast as they could.
It should be said that, I mean, the American Revolution just shocked the European world. Yeah,
it did, and like I mentioned earlier, in a really visceral way, and it kind of captured the imagination in a lot of ways of the general populations of Europe, but the aristocracies of Europe. Besides seeing it as a way of teasing and poking at the British crown, were not pleased with what the American aristocracy was up to.
Yeah, I mean, obviously the French were sort of kindred spirits in this quest for freedom, liberté, as they would say, and the Statue of Liberty in New York has now become a symbol of immigration, but you don't have to interpret it that way at all. It was
never
it's about a fight against tyranny.
Well, it's become a symbol of the Jewish worldview.
Yeah, I mean,
who wrote that poem that Stephen
Emma
Miller
Lazarus
had to
prom.
point out, another Jew, but he had to point that out, that was attached after the statue was constructed, and that was.
And she is the product of this late 19th century Russian, quote unquote, Russian from Russia. Yeah, from Russia immigration, along with the man who wrote the melting pot myth. His name I'm blanking on. He was also a Russian Jew, and it's that's just some bizarre stuff. But
they didn't send us their best.
No, they didn't. They never did. So by 1882, you have I think it's one of the funnier parts of U.S. immigration history is the Chinese Exclusion Act. That's literally the name of the legislation, Chinese Exclusion Act.
Wasn't it the Cooley Act? I
think so. I mean, it may not have been called that, but that was like a slang term.
So I'm sure that was probably a colloquialism of the day.
And basically, it wasn't just Chinese people, but they just regarded every single Asian coming to the United States as a Chinaman. And they had I don't know, it was the Boxer Rebellion, or they had a war basically in China.
Well, they were flooding in to the west to work on the railroad, and the other workers.
Boxer Rebellion was a little bit after. It was a little bit
later.
Yeah, I think so.
1999.
Yeah. But there was a war, and there were a lot of people who were seeking another life elsewhere, and I think that was one of the reasons they came over. But there was such a downward pressure on wages, and they worked long hours. And no one faults their work ethic, but it was basically they displaced a lot of domestic work. And they got really angry at that.
So basically,
please go home.
Yeah, if we want to get into the causes of this immigration like we did with the Irish potato famine, essentially the Chinese dynasty at the time was falling apart. This is why the Boxer Rebellion, I think, ended up happening. My Chinese history is not that great, but the political situation of China had effectively deteriorated, but mostly in part to the British, who continued to cause problems for the Chinese Empire, and also downward pressure from the Russian Empire, which had at that point expanded over China and was putting downward pressure onto their holdings in Manchuria and in Mongolia and other places. And you had this massive influx of Chinese people, but also Koreans, Japanese, so on, especially after Matthew Perry had made contact with some of these Asian groups like Korea and Japan. They were stopped from entering in 1882. So this act completely shut down this immigration, and then they were barred from citizenship. They just said they were essentially shut out of the country in a lot of ways. And if they were still here, they were reduced to just sort of, I don't know, not even like worker visa status. They were just kind of allowed to stay, but they couldn't do anything. And if they misbehaved, deportation was the immediate punishment. So this kind of weird quirk was the best way that they have of keeping, you're right, the wages up. And then 3 years later, they banned contract laborers. So there was serious.
So that means there's only union labor or craftsman guilds, or how does that work?
Yeah, so there's guild systems, there's trade systems, or trade confederation systems, there's early labor unions. By this point, you had imported so many of a lot of Catholics too, who were very into labor consolidation, and were uniting around the causes of the Catholic Church to labor purposes, human dignity purposes was very popular towards the late 19th century, early 20th century for the Catholics. And they also had a general Anglo-Dutch, early German working class all over the country at this point, that especially in the coastal areas, that were impacted. I mean, their wages were going down. Their livelihood wasn't as good. So the Congress and the president worked together, banned cheap labor from Asia, and 3 years later, banned contract laborers. I mean, it was unilateral, it was swift, and they responded immediately to economic pressure on their voting base. I mean, you didn't really have a lot of... This
was a federal
yeah, this is
law?
Federal.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, there were corresponding California area statutes, if I recall correctly. Federal one, because the feds control the actual ports of entry, was the important one.
Yeah. And then in 1888, they started putting in provisions with new additions to the Chinese Exclusion Act to kick out aliens. This is where, like, the illegal alien really starts coming from, expulsion of aliens. And this had always been kind of unclear since 1798, and they made it official. Like, here are our policies on how you're going to be kicked out of the United States and how we're going to handle you, and for whatever reason you're being kicked out. They try to lay it out in great detail. So again, the silver lining of this direct centralization under DC is that they can pass this and it applies everywhere to ensure that the labor market and other things remain stable across the United States. And then you had the Bureau of 1891 Bureau of Immigration was created, and this was done under the Treasury Department, and they were administering all immigration laws from the Treasury Department. Interestingly enough, they saw it, I think, mostly as immigration to and from the United States as predominantly just an economic issue that needed to be tightly controlled and tightly managed, not necessarily a free for all that was based on fields and lowering wages, whatever they saw fit. So by this point, I want to give people some figures. If I can pull up the graph here. So the number of immigrants and their total share of the U.S. population by, like, let's say 1900 was at about 10%, 10 million people, 10.341 million people, which is I'm sorry. I read that wrong. It was actually about 14%, and that's actually not bad, all things considered. When you factor in that a large part have come from pretty rich countries with high standards of population characteristics, not always Italy and not always Ireland, but Germans, Scandinavians, and there are still hundreds of thousands of people from Britain coming in every year. So your responsibilities in assimilating these British and Canadians and Dutch were far less than bringing in people from Eastern Europe, from Ireland, or as we saw that they put an end to, like Asia. By this time, this is when, like, the progressive era is supposed to have started. But in 1903, they ban polygamists and anarchists. So we this in our last episode.
Wait a minute. How do you identify somebody as an anarchist? Excuse me. Are you an anarchist?
I think
say yes. I mean, come on.
I mean, I'm not totally sure. I think that I'm assuming that there was correspondence regarding why they were leaving. So if you were getting on a ship to the United States, presumably on that ship there would be a record of your purpose for leaving and a purpose for getting on the ship, like a manifest. And if you were identified as a political dissident, if you were an anarchist coming out of Germany or Russia, maybe that's a way to have found you. Now, I guess
the more substantive reason is so that if you start engaging in anarchist activity in the U.S.,
report you.
They can say, "Oh, you lied in your immigration form. Your citizenship, even if it's been granted, your citizenship is revoked.
Yeah.
If we haven't granted it, then you're just, like, deported. You got to go back."
Right.
Yeah.
If I can ask just a maybe in the weeds question, but how did actually deportation take place? I mean, was there, let's just say the guy didn't have any money and you're like, okay, we're sponsoring the deportation ship. Like, who pays for that? I mean, how do they arrange passage for this guy? You know, the ship is not obligated to take people, you know, if they can't afford to.
My assumption is that the federal government paid people. If you have a ship going to Ireland for whatever purpose, and you go to the captain, or you go to the shipping line or the shipping conglomerate at the time, and you say, on your next 2 trips to Ireland, we have 30 guys who have been declared illegal aliens for a variety of purposes and are no longer allowed in the country, and we're holding them, we're detaining them until such time as we can pay you to detain them on your ship and drop them off back in the port of Ireland.
I mean, that's one way. I'm just asking because I'm curious about how this stuff actually gets done, because it tells you how much will there is for one. Because if there's a will, there's usually ways. So another way you could do is you could strong arm these shipping lines. Say, hey, look, if you don't take these people back, you don't have access to the port. I mean, I don't know if they'd be willing to go that far, but it's like there are so many ways things can get done. And they say, oh, you can't build the wall. How are you going to do that? I don't know. Like, we built an interstate highway system that cost $500 billion. I mean, it seems like putting up a bunch of bricks on a border seems pretty easy by comparison. How are we going to do it? Well, we have a motivation. We have a will to do it. And I think if you have that, you can do anything you want. Just about.
I mean, and you also can hold the shipping lines accountable. Like, if you determine which shipping line had helped get Irish prostitutes, who were clearly prostitutes, onto the ship and then delivered them in the United States, you can then go to that shipping conglomerate and said, hey, 3 months ago when you showed up, you brought 15 Irish whores with you, or 20 Hungarian anarchists, or 13 Northern English murderers from jail on your ship, and you dropped them off at this port. You dropped them off in Boston.
You can threaten them to sue or something like that. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's all these ways.
And also, like at this time, it's still kind of a gentleman's thing, and it's like you don't want to be on someone's bad side in the port of Boston. You don't want to be bad. You don't want to be on the bad side of the Port Authority. Because I mean, at this time, shipping trade, the global shipping industry was booming. Like, if you got in trouble and you weren't allowed to dock in American ports anymore, you went out of business, and someone replaced you very quickly. There were not. It was still very fluid. You had groups that were well established, but it was a lot easier to get into the shipping business, even into the transportation business. So I wanna say that, like, by around this time, you have an individual starting to write about these problems. The one and only Madison Grant. Madison Grant is sort of the father of the American environmental conservationist movement. Here, he's also the father of what's often called scientific racism. And Madison Grant is writing things like Conquest of a Continent and Passing of the Great Race, where he tries to give an ethnic taxonomy of the American people up to that point. And he tries to lay out that the founding stock is this sort of Nordic Teutonic stock that should remain not only the majority, but should have absolute power. I mean, it's their birthright, and they demonstrate that it was best managed, and that there should be limited immigration and a large amount of deportations of people back to Europe for a variety of purposes. So if they came from somewhere he didn't like, or if their percentage of the population in any given area had grown too big, they would just be deported. And it was at the time to write this was not really controversial. Madison Grant was kind of an aristocrat, and a lot of people liked him. A lot of people liked his writing. A lot of people thought he was right, and he always, he was kind of arguing early on about what we now call scale, like the MPC version of scale, where he was mostly concerned with the ecology of North America. He was concerned with the governmental system of the American Republic, but also just how North America would function with large and larger amounts of immigration and larger populations, and what effects this would have long term on the environment of North America. And we'll get to him in a minute, but someone had asked me before the show if I would be mentioning Madison Grant. So here's the drop on him. He worked very hard to get pieces of immigration law passed, like in the 1924 Immigration Act, which we'll get to.
Ooh, wait, I have a lot to say about that. You want to get to that later?
Yeah, but I mean that was kind of one of his brainchilds that his brainchild filtered down into that. But Nick had mentioned earlier, I almost forgot, the Russian or from Russia immigration that started occurring in later half of the 19th century. So starting in like 1890, you start seeing a large swath of Southern and Eastern Europeans, peaking at like 1.3 million in 1907, completely inundating the United States. And very quickly, they realized that a larger and larger amount of these people were Jewish, and the people who found the United States were never particularly fond of Jews. You can find quotes from Benjamin Franklin asking them for them to be banned. He referred to them as Asiatics, therefore they have no place in the United States. And it didn't really go over well. So like in 1900, we took in about 400, up to that point, 424,000 and 383,000, quote unquote, Russians and Polish. How, the percentage of the population that's Jewish, I'm not sure, but it was large enough where they were able to quickly build up on top of German Jewish populations that were fond of Marx, which is what we addressed in our episode of communism in New England, particularly in the working class districts of New York and to an extent Boston, Philadelphia. You can say that this is another thing we've mentioned in the previous episode. And Benjamin Welton's article on the history of America's Red Scare was the product of this, and it culminated this influx of Jews in the assassination of William McKinley, because the assassin, who was Polish, was a Gentile, was directly inspired by people like Emma Goldman and Berkman and other Russian Jewish anarchists.
Let me mention real quick, I got a correction to make on that. I said that he was. Yeah, I said he was beaten to death by Secret Service. He was nearly beaten to death. He was electrocuted or something like 10 days later. Just for the record.
Okay, that's good. Thanks.
Someone mentioned that to me, and I decided.
Oh, good. I'm glad people are fact checking us. But yeah, so America inherited this anarchist violence as it was starting to die down conspicuously in places like Eastern Europe and in Russia. And that was because we were essentially taking in the primary instigators of violent anarchist thought. And this isn't like ANCAP style Hoppian thought for people who might be curious. This is radical left-wing anarcho-communist thought.
These are not your Free State Project friendly farm owning ANCAPs.
Well, and it's funny because it was even re-exported in the case of, for instance, the assassin of King Umberto I of Italy. He was an American. He was an Italian-American anarchist named Gaetano Bresci, and he claimed that he had wanted to avenge people killed in Milan. There was riots there in 1898, and Leon Sklas. How do you say that? You guys know?
I mean, Solgaj, or I'm not totally sure. I thought it was Solgaj, which would be Hungarian, but I'm not totally sure.
The assassin of McKinley claimed that Bresci's actions were what motivated him.
Interesting.
And there's a lot of feeling on itself, because the anarchists, maybe we'll do an episode on American anarchism, but it fueled on itself things like Haymarket, and then I mentioned in the communist episode the way in which the Sacco and Vanzetti case was manipulated by Willy Munzenberg to become an international cause célèbre for the Red Menace.
And again, if America had a tighter immigration policy, this very well might have never happened. Immigrant policy literally got president killed. So,
I've asked this question before about the Irish, but why were the Russians and Italian groups brought in to places like New York? At least I could see if they're doing labor in Pennsylvania or something, but there was a lot of factory work, and like I said, I think the Jews were doing some of that, but I think fairly quickly they probably transitioned into other activities. And so I'm wondering who was advocating for their importation. Do you know anything about that, Hans?
Well, other Italians. I mean, these people started to inherit these cities that were once tightly controlled and ruled with an iron fist by the Anglo upper class.
And the politics of unions also led to, I mean, there was a strong incentive for them, not just from a sort of ethnic, just a natural ethnic tendency to want to get more of your own, be around your own. There was also economic, financial incentives for them to swell their union ranks with their co-ethnics.
Yeah, and I mean, again, there's no welfare really. I mean, there's very little, and especially for recently arrived immigrant populations. So if you have a foothold like especially the Italians did, it was very easy for poor Italians from southern Italy, from Sicily, to come to the United States and be able to at least survive. I'm not saying thrive, but survive, and off of essentially community welfare, inter-community welfare, and church welfare. There's a good article by the magazine, the National Endowments for the Humanities, on immigration and the Brahmins. And it's mostly about the Immigration Restriction League, IRL. And they were a Bostonian Anglo group that arrived at some pretty Spenglerian civilizational doom conclusions very early on about the fate of New England. So by 1880, Boston was 63% immigrant or the children of immigrants. And this is this was the birthplace of the American Revolution in a lot of ways. This was the cultural center and cultural hub of American literature, American philosophy, American science. This is where MIT comes from. American everything really was deeply rooted in some level, in one way or another, in Boston. And this is where Hawthorne, Emerson, Longfellow, Thoreau, Whittier, Parkman, Adams, Bancroft, all these people, all these elites were born or raised or had a big active life in Boston. And by 1877, Catholics accounted for more than 3/4 of all births in New England. And at that point, Irish Catholics had taken over the city's police and fire departments, the public school system, which had been established a couple decades prior, really, was becoming deserted because the Catholic parents were putting them in Catholic institutional schools or homeschooling. And then in 1884, the city's first Irish Catholic mayor was elected. And then Irish politicians had 68 Massachusetts towns and cities under partial control through various political offices. So Massachusetts, Boston, this immensely important part of the Anglo-American character, had essentially been subsumed by mostly Irish, but then also factor in other Catholics who were there, and various other immigrants who might not be Catholics, but they're German Lutherans or whatever, who are recently arrived or Eastern Europeans. And you can see that very quickly it's turning into this manorial state, which was not what the Anglos really wanted in the United States. So you're asking, why did more and more of these people get imported? And that's because these inner cities were taken over.
Yeah, but I don't think that it really explains it. I go back to my previous theory about the industrialists wanting a national
Yes.
policy of having these people
Yeah.
come in. Because at the city level, they can control some things. But if there's a law, like, was it 1790 when they had that, white persons of good character law?
Yeah.
That's a national thing, and they controlled the border. And you said it was centralized
And that
away from
Naturalization
them
Act.
as well after the war, the Civil War. And that would be a national policy. So whoever's operating at that level has got to have money. And so it's not going to be some local Italian guy.
There's
in
also
Brooklyn.
the local machines have influence in national policy.
Sure,
So
that's
you
true.
have these stories from the more corrupt presidential nominating conventions of the late 1800s, when it's okay, well, you get your Boston machine, you get your your New York machine, your Philadelphia machine bosses, and they sit in a cigar smoke-filled room and pick who they're going to run as their guy. So, if they have a priority on a local basis for increased immigration, that can rapidly trickle upwards to national policy.
Right. That's the tit for tat. We'll give you the votes if you give us this open door policy. Now, I don't know if that was ever actually brought up, though. I'm just curious. I can certainly see how that could work, but I don't know.
Well, I don't know. I'll give you a quote. I don't know if all of the elites, all the industrialists were really in on it. In 18...
I know Carnegie was. I brought him up before, but
there's
a lot of
some
clear
of these
evidence
guys
that
were...
these guys were bringing these people in from Hungary, from Eastern Europe, and they didn't speak any language in common, and they had their own little separate camps, but they all had to go to work in the morning, and it was basically just huge labor pool for them. So
I have a quote here from MIT President Francis Walker, 1890s. Descendant of pure Anglo-Saxon aristocratic blood going back centuries in the U.S. And this is what he said regarding the masses of peasantry from Italy, Hungary, Austria, Russia, so on. These people have no history behind them, which is of a nature to give encouragement. They have none of the inherited instincts and tendencies which made it comparatively easy to deal with the immigration of olden time. They are beaten men from beaten races, representing the worst failures in the struggle for existence. Centuries are against them, as centuries were on the side of those who formerly came to us. Which, could you imagine if Trump got up and said, "Look, these are my thoughts on the Hispanic immigrants coming in." Just, wow. So there was a deep sense of dissatisfaction with, and I would say maybe he doesn't even really mean that. He's being hyperbolic, and he's probably angry. And then you have Thomas Bailey Aldrich in 1895. He wrote this poem, Unguarded Gates, and he was actually from New Hampshire. But he was also kind of this Boston Brahmin tradition. And he wrote, wide open and unguarded stand our gates, and through them presses a wild, motley throng, flying the old world's poverty and scorn, these bringing with them unknown gods and rights. Those tiger passions here to stretch their claws in street and alley with strange tongues loud, accents of menace alien to our air, voices that once the Tower of Babel knew.
Sounds like a good
H.P.
candidate for
Lovecraft.
some plaque replacement.
Yeah. You had, and the article goes on that you had Congressman John F. Fitzgerald, who then gave a July 4th address. He was a second generation Irish American, and he talked about the downtrodden and oppressed of every land who come to mold in their own fashion the weight of fortune and to favor in this the land of their adoption. So you had a huge divide in the old elites, who were the old aristocrats, who were being pushed out, and the new ones who were welcoming their kin in. And to Adam's point, really quickly, it's very. I haven't done research on this, but I could probably very easily find ties to some of these new immigrant or second generation politicians and some of these industrialists. probably very easily.
While we're doing poetry, here is a representative of that WASP elite, H.P. Lovecraft, from 1912. I'll tell you the title of the poem after I read it. When, long ago, the gods created earth, in Jove's fairer image man was shaped at birth. The beasts for lesser parts were next designed. Yet were they too remote from humankind to fill the gap and join the rest to man. The Olympian host conceived a clever plan. A beast they wrought in semi-human figure, filled it with vice, and called the thing a nigger. And the poem is titled On the Creation of Niggers.
He really had a way with words, didn't he?
Oh my God.
He was a brilliant writer.
Why was he writing that? I mean, was he a Southerner? Was he a
No, he was a New Englander. Yeah, he was a New Englander WASP, and
there's this kind of overarching theme in his writing of this like fear of like biological contamination with the other, which I mean you could see how that could kind of translate onto immigration policy.
Yep. I mean, if you're a sensitive, artistic kind of soul, you're very sensitive to the world around you, and seeing strange semi-human figures roaming the streets is an unsettling and even terrifying experience.
Yeah. Do we want to talk about the 20th century?
Yeah, I want to talk about the 1924 Act whenever you're ready, Hans.
We're starting to get into that. So at this point, people are getting fed up. So you have the IRL, the Immigration Restriction League in Boston. They take sort of think tank approach. They're producing white papers, producing pamphlets, and they were never a very big group. They didn't have a lot of members, but they had a lot of institutional and popular power in the American political sphere. And they are very much responsible for bringing in stuff like the 1921 Quota Act, the Great Restriction. So effectively, they succeeded in creating a national quota for limits immigration of each nationality to 3% of the number of foreign-born of that nationality living in the U.S. in 1910. So it was retroactive because they had known that there had been millions more come in since this time that they passed it. And then 1924 National Origins Act quickly followed up. And this was, you have the culmination of these Boston elites, Madison Grant, and other people driving this in an attempt, I think, to, in their minds, save the country. So this sets annual quotas for each nationality at 2% of the number of persons of that nationality in the U.S. as determined by the 1890 census. So they went back even further.
So here's the Jew, Israel Zangwill, talking, this is before 1924. He says, America has ample room for all the 6 millions of the Pale. Any one of her 50 states could absorb them. And next to being in a country of their own, there could be no better fate for them than to be together in a land of civil and religious liberty, of whose constitution Christianity forms no part, and where their collective votes would practically guarantee them of against future persecution. So, wow. If you read, I would point everyone to what I would say is the definitive work on Jewish involvement in the U.S. immigration policy. That would be Kevin McDonald's work on the subject. I think it's just 1965. It's Jewish involvement in shaping America immigration policy, 1881 to 1965 historical review. Very, very good paper. Goes over a lot. And for the period in question, up until the 1924 Act, MacDonald has a couple things to say. I won't quote. I'll just paraphrase him for now. He argues that there was sort of they were making a lot of progress from the period of 1891 into 1924, in exploiting these various aspects of the American situation, namely the existence of various ethnicities already, white ethnicities, but various ethnicities, and the secular foundations of the state, etc., as you see in the Zangwill quote. And what happens in 1924 is the hammer comes down a little bit, thanks to people like Grant and Stoddard, and that effectively, Professor McDonald argues, that it basically maintained some of the WASP power up until the final blow that the Jewish lobbyists struck against us in 1965.
Yeah, we're gonna jump to 65 now.
Well, let me just say one thing on the 24. There was a well-known Zionist, this is quoting from McDonald's paper, it's a well-known Zionist author, Maurice Samuel, who says, in response to the 1924 immigration law, which was heavily opposed by Jews, if then the struggle between us, i.e. Jews and Gentiles, is ever to be lifted beyond the physical, your democracies will have to alter their demands for racial, spiritual, and cultural homogeneity with the state. But it would be foolish to regard this as a possibility, for the tendency of this civilization is in the opposite direction. There is a steady approach towards the identification of government with race instead of with the political state. And McDonald points out in his paper, this ties in very heavily to what Hans described earlier as scientific racism, as put forward by people like Stoddard and Grant. And that's wherein you get the issues with Boasian anthropology and the attempt to discredit fact-based racial evaluations of people, and instead to move into this sort of we can't actually know anything about racial groups, and we're just the total imposition of the current zeitgeist, basically.
Yeah. So before we jump to 65, because I know a lot of people are curious about the Hart-Celler Act, I want to just rattle off really quickly little pieces of legislation that led up to it. The Bracero program in 43, which had bilateral agreements for guest workers from Latin American countries and Jamaica. Then you had the Act December 17, which repealed the Chinese Exclusion Act. But in 1921, we had put in what's called the Asiatic Barred Zone, where we essentially banned immigrants from Turkey, Saudi Arabia, the Polynesian Islands, Japan, Korea, China, parts of Russia, totally banned. And if they were diplomats or other individuals coming, they were highly, highly monitored, and they were not to leave certain control while they were here. You had the Displaced Persons Act of 1948, which was allowing some refugees from Europe, a couple 100,000 at the most over time. And then you had an Internal Security Act, 1950. And then in 1952, Immigration Naturalization Act. This is after World War II. You have a lot of pressure coming to let in vast swaths of people from Europe, vast swaths of people from the Third World, and that was put down very quickly. The U.S. public was not interested. Reaffirmed national origins quotas, new grounds for exclusion based on political activities, ideology, and sexual preference. So if you were an anarchist gay, and you had been here for a little while, now you could officially just be kicked out.
When was Operation Wetback?
Operation Wetback was in the 50s. I almost forgot. Thank you. That was Eisenhower. We deported, I think, 1.5 or 6 million Hispanics back across the border.
Wait, hold on. I have it on reliable authority that is actually like physically impossible.
And he did it
physically. Nick, it's only possible to come in. You can't go the other direction. That's just not possible.
Oh,
physically,
shit, okay.
It's actually impossible. It's a black hole.
Immigration is a physically linear system. I hope you know that. But
all right.
But these people were physically removed over the space of like 3 or 4 months, just cleaned out, and the U.S. public pretty much didn't bat an eye. It was underreported. No one really gave a shit.
No one cares.
And Yeah, people just flat out didn't care. Like I'm not even exaggerating. Like it was not a big deal to the average American. Who cares?
Well, let's put it this way. Today nobody cares, but they're forced to care.
Yes. I think that's pretty much accurate. So finally we come to it was 1954, by the way. That was Operation Wetback started. We come to Hart-Celler Act, the Immigration Act of 1965. Now, a lot of people talk about this as the watershed moment in American immigration and American demographics, and they're right. Basically, the national quota system completely done away with, completely gutted. And we had a general cap, according to this early legislation, on how many we could let in every year. And they would say 20,000 per country ceilings and a 7-category preference system, which would favor close relatives of U.S. citizens and permanent resident aliens, those with occupational skills, and refugees, among other points. So it was an attempt to craft legislation that was more focused on family reunification, but in order to get past Emanuel Celler and Hart and others, kind of worked out that it would also factor in occupational employment capability, skill capability, but that barely factored in. It's barely factored into immigration law sense. You had 120,000 ceiling from the Western Hemisphere, and then 170,000 ceiling for the Eastern Hemisphere annually, essentially. Do you have something, Nick?
Well, so it removed, so that you have, the quotas are just by hemisphere. There's no actual, because the key with the 65 Act is that it removes any reference to national ethnic origins.
Correct.
And
completely.
So you have a comment by Senator Jacob Javits. It was the debate, during the debate that occurred on it. He says, both the dictates of our consciences as well as the precepts of sociologists tell us that immigration, as it exists in the national origins quota system, is wrong, and without any basis in reason or fact, for we know better than to say that one man because of the color of his skin. Where have I heard this before?
Yeah. It was a total lie from start to finish. It was a lie to the American people about the nature of the law, about what they sought to do, and it also factored into flat out just post-war guilt. So there was a lot of talk of, this is where this meme of America didn't let in enough immigrants or enough refugees during World War II, and this got people killed. And when you factor in Nick's comments on Boasian anthropology, and sort of they were going under the rise of the existentialist movement, where, and behaviorism, nothing really matters, right? Who you are doesn't matter. We're all just sort of walking packs of stimulus nerves waiting to be triggered by something, right? So I want to read a quote from Ed Kennedy, who's a subcommittee chairman from Massachusetts who helped get this passed.
Do you mean Ted Kennedy?
Edward Kennedy, Senator Edward Kennedy. Yeah, Ted Kennedy.
Okay.
Same thing.
First, our cities will not be flooded with 1 million immigrants annually. Under the proposed bill, the percent level of immigration remains substantially the same. Second, the ethnic mix of this country will not be upset. Contrary to the charges in some quarters, the bill will not inundate America with immigrants from any one country or another, or area, or the most popular and deprived nations of Africa and Asia. He also went on to say, talking about the critics, we're telling him that's just a lie. The charges I have mentioned are highly emotional and irrational and with little foundation in fact. They are out of line with the obligations of responsible citizenship. They breed hate of certain heritage.
You might be right, but you're full of hate. Your hate facts are just not compatible with the sort of society we're trying to engineer here.
What do you do when somebody calls you a witch? I mean, that's basically what we're living in right now.
Yeah. What do you do when I mean, you can't even have, and this is where this starts, you can't even have a debate now. Like what Stephen Miller ran into at this most recent press conference. You can't even say, maybe we should check if they have a skill. Maybe we should check if they can do something. Like, it doesn't matter if they already have family here. Can they do something? Can they help? Can they help in some way? Are they going to be a burden? You can't even ask that. Like, it's hate-filled.
Well, it was a big emphasis on family reunion kind of stuff like that we hear now over skills or whatever, which would have been, I guess, the sensible or, the thing you could sell easier.
I got a reunion.
Do you have numbers on the amount of family reunification visas versus
other? I mean, I don't necessarily have numbers on that. I do have numbers on the amount of people coming in and where they're coming from, just to give you guys an idea. So Burmilla wrote this book, Alien Nations, in the early 90s. So bear with me. Immigrants do come, this is a quote from him, predominantly from one area. Some 85 of the 16.7 million legal immigrants arriving in the United States between 1968, which is when the Hart-Celler Act officially took effect, and 1993 came from the third world. So 85% of 16.7 million. These are legal people. This is not refugees. This is not political asylum. This is not illegal immigration coming from the third world. 47% are from Latin America and the Caribbean, 34% from Asia, and the remaining, Also, they also came like disproportionately from one country. 20% alone came from Mexico. Nothing like this had been seen in the history of the United States. I mentioned that, like,
do you know how big the immigrant population is right now? I've heard.
Yeah, nobody does.
What's the low high?
In 2015, the number of legally accounted for immigrants is sitting at around 13.5% of the population, which is not. It's just actually not totally historic high. It's close though. But we're looking at in total 43.29 million legal immigrants.
Currently,
these aren't citizens. These aren't citizens. These are people who are still immigrant status in 2015.
So that's 12%, something like that.
That's in 2015. That was 13.5.
Okay, so I heard a statistic on Fast the Nation that 22% of the prisoners in the United States are immigrants. So they're obviously more highly represented there.
And I think we listened to the same episode, and I think Jazz Hands even said that's probably undershooting it. It's probably 30-40%.
I've heard 30 from other sources, but I don't know.
I dug up the numbers on family reunification.
Oh, you did?
Yeah, I have numbers from the 2001 census. I wasn't able to get the 2011 numbers, but I believe there has been a radical change in the composition. Approximately 2/3 of all legal immigration is now attributed to family reunification visas. But this is extremely concentrated. So, for instance, if you look at legal Mexican immigration, it is 95% family reunification visas. It's about 75% for the Philippines, 60% for China, 98% for the Dominican Republic, 95% for Jamaica. Like, the rule of thumb seems to be the crappier the place, the more people are apt to get their relatives out of it.
So going back to my consistent theme of why is this being allowed when the native population, from what I can tell and from certain polls at least, don't really want this to be happening. In the case of California, and this is a surprise to me, but apparently Cesar Chavez, the great leader of the farm workers of the Central Valley in California, where all the agricultural fruit and vegetable pickers are, who are often Hispanic, he actually was against undocumented illegal immigrants because it was putting downward pressure on wages. So you see this very consistent economic theme of more cheap labor, good if you're a big business. And this is actually what Ann Coulter, of all people, accuses the Republicans of doing, is that they're in bed with the big business lobby because they want cheap labor.
So,
and the Democrats, are obviously looking for votes, but okay, go ahead.
I have actually a statistic. I mean, I agree with you, but I was cycling through some key points of Bernald's book, and I found this. In 93, family preference applicants made up 95% of the 3.4 million individuals in line for U.S. immigration visas. 95%. These aren't people who are like coming to start a better life. They're coming here just to like be with their family and have more kids, and there's no indication of skill set.
Another major attempt that was made, the McCarran-Walter Act, attempted immigration, and after being opposed by one of the key provisions in this was something that would have prevented dual citizenship. If you're someone who lived abroad for 5 years or more, I believe it was, you could not maintain American citizenship. And this was right after the creation of the Zionist Project. And so the various Jewish organizations and these hardcore Zionists were up in arms about this. And I just wanted to note what a congressman at the time, John Rankin, had to say. He said, "They whine about discrimination. Do you know who's being discriminated against? The white Christian people of America, the ones who created this nation. I'm talking about the white Christian people of the North as well as the South. Communism is racial. The minority seized control in Russia and in all her satellite countries, such as Poland, Czechoslovakia, and many other countries I could name. They've been run out of practically every country in Europe in the years gone by, and if they keep stirring the tree and trying to force their communistic program on the Christian people of America, there is no telling what will happen to them here." And this was also interesting here was that there was the people were still trying to do something about the communist subversion of America, and they're pointing out that, well, there's a lot of communists coming from here, and so if we allow people to bring their whole families, we're going to get a lot of communists. And the various American Jewish organizations and the Communist Party of the USA were all copacetic on this issue.
Yeah.
And yeah, go ahead.
I mean, I have a statistic on how people felt about immigration going into 1965. 72% of the population was adamantly opposed to increasing immigration in 1965. 72%. So that's not like, that's people who are adamantly opposed, and then I don't know how many were in favor, and then how many didn't, were just undecided or thought, remain neutral. Just
so what people, this is oft repeated in your civics class, if those even exist anymore, but if people see that their congressperson is voting for something like this when they themselves are against it, you need to vote them out. It's pretty simple in a democracy, but most people don't have time, they don't pay attention, and they're just lied to constantly that they kind of just give up. But that's pretty clear signal that people were not behind this.
Yeah, I think people were predominantly lied to. I think members of Congress were lied to. I think they didn't totally know what they were voting for.
Great.
I think back in the day, that was probably true with the passage of the original act. I think by this point, it's pretty clear what they're voting for when one of these periodic pushes for comprehensive immigration reform comes on the docket.
Well, you no longer have a Rankin in Congress. The closest you had was Trafficant, and you saw what happened to Trafficant.
He's referring to James Trafficant, I think the Ohio congressman who Was put in jail for criticizing our greatest ally. One would speculate, at least.
Yeah. And
in the system at the time, you had people who had the interests of the actual American people in mind, and now you just have a bunch of parasitic leeches who really shouldn't even be pumping gas. I mean, they should be in a fucking gulag. One man's opinion.
They're whores. They're whores. They go for money and power. That's it. They don't care about whom they're representing.
I mean,
and some of them do, but then they never get access to the club because people know if there's somebody who has principle. I don't know how Ron Paul ever got as far as he did, but you could see how they tried to shut him out when he ran in 2012.
Yeah. Well, in the 30s, we only took in 500,000 immigrants. This is after we put in, several pieces of legislation that caused the first great lull, or the second great lull in immigration. And in the 40s, even post-war immigrants combined into this only took in 1 million people or so. We weren't taking that many. And 50s, not much. And then after 65, and with amendments to the bill, the Hart-Celler Act, they increased the worldwide ceiling to 290,000 or so to take annually. So they're pitching it to the country.
But it's like 1 million now, I've heard.
Yeah, I know, but they're pitching it to the country as like, you see, we have a cap. Like, it doesn't matter even if, like, it's not going to change the ethnic mix of the country, and we have a cap that's lower than what it's been historically. Don't worry, like, we know what we're doing. And this is where things get weird, because then you have the Indo-Chinese Refugee Acts that are being passed, and we're taking in hundreds of thousands of refugees from Indochina. And this is where political asylum laws become liberalized, where we're taking in, you can just fly to the United States to clear political asylum because, I don't know, you have a mean communist country at home, and you're in. We're not sending you back, and you can bring your family, you can have a bunch of kids, whatever. We don't care. This is where it all falls apart. In '66, we had a Cuban Extension Act, like Management Act, that I had forgotten to mention. That's giving priority access to Cubans coming from the Castro, escaping the Castro regime, which is how South Florida came under the control of the Cubans, essentially, and it affects American politics now. You have to adjust your agenda somehow to the Cuban community to win Florida every election cycle. Yeah, like it's ridiculous. Like, that you have to play these ethnic games, and you have to tinker your policy just so you can win an election. It's just totally ridiculous. You can't even do I'm not one way or another on the Cuba issue.
No,
but
the United States is the UN, and if anybody thinks that the UN functions well, take a look at how America's functioning right now.
Yeah. I mean, it became a clusterfuck, in lesser words. And by the 70s, by the way, this is starting to happen across the civilized world, or the first world. You have several rulings in France that open up the doors to French immigration from Muslim countries, primarily Algeria, Morocco, other places like that.
Like 1960s.
Yeah, the 60s, but the 70s is when it just gets out of control. They're just bringing in millions of people into France. They're bringing in millions of, after several different passings of the British Nationality Act through the 40s, the 50s, they kept amending it. Canada had the UN, by the way, had the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination in 1965, and the Canadians really internalized it. And then in '78, they passed an Immigration Act that was essentially the ultimate multicultural, anyone can come, skills that are not necessary Immigration Act. So Australia also underwent a similar problem. So basically, everywhere in the Western world between the 40s and the 70s after World War II, one by one, all of us in the first Western world got hit with these weird asylum and asylum and immigration rulings. So I don't know if there's much else to say about 65 other than I want to describe two things, and I'll include them in the YouTube video for you guys to see. Two really great terms that Brumlow's coined. One's the pincer, and the other one's called the wedge. Pincer is the decreasing, narrowing white population of the United States coming in from both sides. So on the one side, we have increasing percentage population that is, let's say, black and Asian, and so on, that are already here and have grown naturally. And then on the other, you have increasing immigration, enhancing those numbers. And slowly, the white population is shrinking and shrinking. This is why by like 2042, we're going to be in the minority. And by the other one, by the term wedge, I mean there's a natural level that the population should have capped off at without immigration. If immigration had never been really resurrected in 65 going forward. And you can imagine essentially a rectangle, big bar pointing up with little waves and level the pot in the United States naturally. And then a giant triangle on top of it on one of its sides shooting upwards. That is the level of the population where we're at now, this sharp increase because of trends in the immigration system that have completely destroyed any sense of keeping the population at a natural level, which in effect goes against everything that Kennedy and LBJ and others said would happen.
You want to talk about 1986?
Yeah, really briefly. For all you people who think Reagan was a great president, was great on the immigration issue, you're lying, or you just don't know. This guy helped pass the Immigration Reform and Control Act, IRCA, and this gave amnesty and permanent residence to 3 million undocumented aliens. And
2 million in LA alone, I've heard.
Oh yeah. I mean, the employer sanctions went down. Immigrant Anti-Discrimination Agency in the Justice Department is established. There's a special agricultural worker program. If you want to know where MS-13 in America comes from, there's only two words you need to know. It's Ronald Reagan. And
the drug war and all this stuff.
Yeah,
there's
but
a lot going
Reagan, you can go back and watch videos where Reagan just bold-faced lies about what this is going to be and what his plans are.
I don't know. Sometimes I wonder if he really just was asleep during his presidency, because the stuff that they were doing at the State Department, the CIA, and H.W. Bush running around doing all the dirty tricks he was pulling in Iran-Contra. I mean, Reagan just did not seem to know what was happening. I won't say...
Well, he literally didn't know what was happening. Assassination attempt. I mean, he was basically half retarded, and the White House was being run by Bush.
Yeah, I mean, in a lot of ways it was. And the drug war, he had no clue. Maybe he did, but as far as I could tell, he really was unaware of a lot of these things.
He was just a confused actor who was a tool for the same people that ran the White House for the next, well, up until now. And maybe they still do.
Yep.
They still do. I mean,
pretty much.
So,
they still do, guys.
Added the next credence, I guess, that it was old W. Bush, or Herbert Walker Bush. Yeah. In 1990, they passed a new Immigration Act and increased the cap to 675,000. Over 2 times what the previous cap was annually.
So what did the little people do? I mean, at this point, if anybody's been listening, it's kind of increasingly obvious that the little people really have no say. It's the people with power. So what do we do?
Well, even the people with power, with the lesson I take from the early 20th century half of this, is that even the people who did have power, the old WASP elite, they were beaten out by the new Jewish power and the various WASP elites that sold out to that power. That's what happened. I mean, they put up a little bit of a fight for a little while, but they were destroyed. And now America, there is no longer, to the extent that there's still a WASP elite, they're not a WASP elite running America for the posterity of the WASP. They're the lackeys of the people who do run America.
To drive home the point that
it's more apt, I think, to say that they sort of hybridized. Like, there's still a lot. If you look at, extremely high level management positions at large companies, or undersecretaries and assistant secretaries of cabinet departments, like, you're going to see a lot of Gentiles. And
go ahead, Hank. Sorry.
I mean, what you seem to have seen historically is that, like, you have one group of white people using immigration as a weapon against another group of white people. You have a faction that is desperate to use immigration and population flows more generally as a weapon against people that they think, either consciously or subconsciously, are not really worthy of having their own sort of identity or interests taken part of. This is why you always see, when they're trying to pick someplace to settle refugees, it's never Puerto Rico or New York City. It's
Harlem.
Always I mean, do you know how cheap it is to, like, house somebody in Puerto Rico compared to any place else in the continental United States? It would be a great idea.
Yeah.
But it's a lot more fun if you can find some isolated village in New Hampshire and fuck those guys. Like, here's your 400 person refugee wave.
Well, Hank, I don't disagree with respect to things like the hybridization or whatever, but that's my point specifically, was that WASPs no longer act as WASPs. They no longer act explicitly as WASPs for WASPs, as you'll see in the older statesmen and the older writers. And even people who represent effectively white nationalism, many of the prominent white nationalists in America are WASPs, but you don't hear them talk about it much. I mean, what Drew Fraser calls them, the silent race.
The conception of, like, WASP identity, I think, has shifted to a very sort of, like, ideological self-conception, where it's not as explicitly ethnic, perhaps, as in the past, or even as explicitly cultural. But they sure seem to be effective at getting their own sons and daughters into prominent positions in society. Like,
well,
they seem to advocate for their own interests just fine.
Well, their own personal little interests, but as right. Hans gave us this summary of the early history of the country, in which the WASPs wanted to maintain their dominance over the country, their justly earned dominance over the country. And
so, I mean, I think if I was going to ascribe a thought process to it, I would say that they got high on their own supply. They thought of themselves as sort of so morally superior to their betters in the broader population that it wasn't necessary for them to be a numerical majority, when instead they could exert this sort of moral guidance to the rest.
Look at the Bush family and H.W. Bush in particular, this SOB. I mean, I can go on about how rotten this guy has been for this country, but he was behind NAFTA, and his little pawn, Clinton, was the guy who signed it, but they were working together to run drugs. And who's, is his grandson, who's basically Jeb Bush's son, who was supposed to be the successor, to the Bush dynasty. Yeah, his Jeb's wife is from Mexico, I think, and they've had such constant interaction between Mexico and Central America. Jeb Bush was allegedly running the money laundering operation in the Texas banks to get drug money back and forth between Venezuela.
The Bush dynasty seems to have tried to transition themselves to this sort of it's the Mexican model explicitly.
Yeah,
you
basically.
have this sort of Blanco caste of wealthy capital owners ruling over this brown peasant horde without enough political agency or honestly enough on the ball to challenge their supremacy.
Hank, I agree with some of the dynamics and mentality that you mentioned, and we will do an episode on WASP specifically, the decline of WASP. I won't say too much about it because it will be a special episode, but my personal take is that it's better explained simply by the fact that Jews have colonized their minds, and they basically need a pogrom in their minds.
Do you guys want to top this off with Prop 187?
Yeah,
California?
I have.
Yeah, that's a good closing note.
I have a couple things to say, but why don't you cue it up?
It's an interesting story. Basically, illegal immigration at this point is out of control. There's at least 10 or more million illegal immigrants in the country.
What year is this?
This is 1994. This is in the middle of the Clinton White House. The first term of the Clinton White House. And we have a Republican in charge of California, Pete Wilson. And the legislation got introduced by Dick Mountjoy of Monrovia.
Jesus Christ.
He was a GOP assemblyman from SoCal, and he called it the Save Our State Initiative, SOS. And it was pretty clear what he was hinting at. So at this point, Hispanic population in California is growing at massive proportions. So is the Asian population.
Well, right now, whites are a minority in California.
Yeah, and a lot of it was legal. And Pete Wilson and GOP assemblymen and the people in the state Senate got together and got this bill going. And some of the ads for it are still on YouTube. You can go look for Save Our State ads. And they look like an ad out of the Trump campaign last year. They really do. Same issues.
Yep.
And now this passed. Before I explain what it was really, I want to say this passed with 59% of the vote in liberal California. And all but, I think, 5 or 6 counties voted for it.
I have some breakdown on that. So I have 60% of Southern California's white residents voted for Proposition 187. 53% of blacks and Asians, so actually a majority of them voted for it. However, 23% of Hispanics were for it, and the complement 77 were against.
Yeah. So the areas where the majority of the county voted no were all essentially a Bay Area. So it's interesting that the people up there do not feel as pressured as SoCal white city. LA County went green or voted yes, which is insane, especially when you look at it in retrospect.
Yeah.
So basically, and I'll explain
this was right around the time of the Rodney King riots, and everybody and all the news was showing photos of white cops, bullying people. You look at the photo of the incoming class for the LAPD.
The most recent one.
There was one out of maybe 200 Hispanic, black, and Asian officers. There was maybe one.
Yeah,
white
that was
person
their
in there.
like explicit kind of like outreach program, not the entering class per se.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, they know who they're reaching out to. So this bill had a lot of very important elements. Law enforcement agents were, if they suspected someone had been arrested in violation of immigration laws, they had to investigate that person's immigration status, and then they had, if they found anything, they had to report it immediately to the Attorney General's office and to also to INS. And it barred local governments, municipalities across California from disagreeing with any part of the legislation as well. And if you were found suspected of applying for benefits of being illegal immigrants, you were hit with like serious fines. If you were a legal immigrant, you can't receive public social services, you can't receive health care, you can't go to school, you can't go to elementary or secondary school. Every school district would have to verify the legal status of each parent and guardian of every child. Like they literally were gonna like go and see if your mom and dad were here illegally or not. I mean, this is pretty hardcore legislation, and if they were also keeping they were growing a database of illegal immigrant crimes and legal immigrants' identities to help screen for them and their families in the future. So this legislation was passed with essentially almost 60%. This is a pretty big mandate, and the federal court, I believe, Adam, was I think the Ninth Circuit found it to be unconstitutional. Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, I can get into the legal analysis a little bit, which is, like, if you want to just start snorting raw black pills, like, just start looking at, like, Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals.
Which is San Francisco, I believe.
Well, that's where they're headquartered. They actually rule over most of the West, everything from Nevada to California to Hawaii. I'm not sure if Alaska's in there as well, but it's a huge amount of people. Their putative justification for this is basically, well, immigration is a federal responsibility, so a state can't do anything with respect to immigration, which is insane. It's like there are innumerable areas of federal law that like have coincident like state interest, and states, like, I mean, it would be crazy to say that like states don't have an interest in establishing who is and isn't a lawful resident of the state. I mean, like, try doing literally anything interacting with the state government. They're going to ask you to prove that you are a lawful resident of the state. Like, try opening a bank account, try getting a driver's license, try purchasing a firearm.
I don't know about the driver's license these days, but yeah.
Yeah, I mean, not so much anymore. They will ask you to prove that you're, I mean, theoretically, they'll ask you to prove that you're a resident of the state.
Yeah, big deal.
So, I mean, like, that implies like a certain amount of interest in like the composition of people receiving services. And like, more to the point, there's no rationale for why you wouldn't be able to, like, to say nothing of establishing the whether somebody is here legally or illegally, for people that beyond a shadow of a doubt are not citizens. Like, so for instance, people who are on non-immigration visas, or just who are here on visas, like, there seems to be no justification for why the state couldn't decide to exclude services or charge them their full cost. Like, there are a hell of a lot of foreign students who are here on student visas. Their parents are here for work or whatever.
Yeah.
And
that's a good example.
Yeah. They go to public schools, and they're provided services at taxpayer expense. There's a blog at Education.
Well, they pay more to the university system because they're out of state, but they still do it. And
so it depends if they're. So the University of California has really screwed up for obvious reasons. Ideas about who is and isn't a resident of California. If you move to California your senior year as a citizen, your senior year of high school, they will charge you out-of-state tuition. On the other hand, if you are not even a citizen, but you claim to have resided in California for a certain number of years, they will give you in-state tuition. So, I mean, it's all sorts of messed up, and the reasoning is, needless to say, a bit specious, and like, if consistently applied to other areas that are theoretically like the feds are responsible for them, would disallow enormous swaths of things that nobody contends that the state lacks the ability to regulate. But it's indicative of this idea that, like, I mean, California tried. Like, there's this meme that, like, California just sort of rolled over peacefully. Like, the full resources of the federal government were deployed to prevent California from doing anything to enforce extremely reasonable provisions of laws that were already duly passed and being tacitly ignored by the federal government in violation of its own responsibilities.
And they did the same thing to Arizona.
Exactly. I mean, this has happened repeatedly, where, like, the federal government will pass a law, refuse to enforce it, and then use the existence of the law to prevent a state or local government from living up to the responsibilities they're refusing to uphold.
Wow. That's a sick racket they got there, isn't it?
Yeah, it's freaking great. It's almost like you're being governed by a hostile power.
Yeah. What a thought.
So, I think the lesson from the Save Our State initiative is that even if you band together to try and save yourself, try and do what you need to keep the ethnic mix even at an unfavorable level at that point. It's not as if it was at the historic levels. You're just going to get shot down, and the first thing they're going to do as soon as they regain power, which is what the Democrats did, is they increased immigration to California. They reduced standards that illegal immigrants needed to take. They made it a lot easier for them to get access to healthcare and universities over time. And California has millions of illegal immigrants now. I mean, California is barely like 30% white at this point. The historically red aberration in SoCal, Orange County, is probably going to go blue by 2020, which will mean the end of the that WASP class that I essentially built early California. It'll be completely closed out of the state that they helped develop. And if you look at the Bay Area, it's completely swamped in mostly Hispanic, but Asian immigration as well. That illegal and legal.
It's mostly Asian.
Yeah, illegal and legal. That it's completely shot any idea of like the charming Bay Area Valley tech scene of Robert Shockley and others. That's gone now, and that's probably never coming back. California tried to save itself. It didn't. The meme that the country has about California is based on recent experience, and there's no saving California anymore. I would say that there's not much hope in saving Nevada or Arizona either. That the American Southwest,
or Texas for that matter.
Yeah, the American Southwest and Texas is they're going to fall one by one. It's going to be Arizona next, and then Nevada's already mostly fallen. and
Utah's
go to
got
Texas.
it. Colorado's got it. It's crazy. It's basically, I mean, it includes the Northwest, but it's basically the whole Southwest. The part that used to be part of Mexico, they have done a number. They've taken it back. I mean, it's the Reconquista movement writ large.
Yep. It would be like we never defeated Santa Anna in Texas. Like we never won the Mexican-American War.
It's Montezuma's revenge.
Even though we crushed this country, just completely crushed them and marched down to Mexico City and held a sword to their leaders and made them give up this territory to us. We've let it go back. And there's going to be no save our state initiatives in Arizona or Nevada or Colorado. There won't be. So I think people have to contend with the immigration we're talking about in the Northeast and in the Southwest has made these parts of the country lost territory. They're like Burmelo made a point that alien nations, it came true.
Well, as the ancient proverb says, the rising tide of color sinks all boats.
Mister? Nothing? Yes, you are. You're trespassing on private property. Trespassing? Loitering too, man. That's right, you're loitering too. I didn't see any signs. What you call that? Graffiti? No, man. That's not fucking graffiti. That's a sign. He can't read it, man. I'll read it for you. It says this is fucking private property. No fucking trespassing. This means fucking you. It says all that? Yeah. Well, maybe he wrote it in fucking English. I could fucking understand it. Thinks he's being funny. I'm not laughing. I'm not either. Wait a minute. Hold it, fellas. We're getting off on the wrong foot here, okay? This is a gangland thing, isn't it? We're having a territorial dispute. I mean, I've wandered into your pissing ground or whatever the damn thing is, and you've taken offense with my presence, and I can understand that. I mean, I wouldn't want you people in my backyard either. This is your home, and your home is your home, and I respect that. So, if you would just back up a step or two, I'll take my problems elsewhere. Okay? Fair enough? What do you think? I think it should be a toll. Good idea. It should be a toll. Listen, fellas, I've had a really rare morning. I mean, I'm not in the mood to... What should he pay? How about that fucking briefcase, man? Good idea. Give us your briefcase, man. I'm not giving you my goddamn briefcase. Motherfucker, give us your motherfucking briefcase. Okay. I mean, I was willing to mind my own business. I was willing to respect your territory and treat you like a man, but you couldn't leave it alone, could you? You couldn't let a man sit here for 5 minutes and take a rest on your precious piece of shit hill? Okay. But my briefcase? I'll get it for you, all right? You can have my briefcase. Here, you want my briefcase? Here's my briefcase! Here's my briefcase, huh? Wait a minute, wait! Here! Hey, where you going, huh? Where you going? You forgot the briefcase! You forgot the briefcase! I'm going home! Clear a path, you motherfucker! Clear a path! I'm going home! How'd they do that?